I was put on board of a packet and we sailed for Austin. And as I have now, and then taken the liberty to speak of physical sufferings, I shall be forgiven if, in order to afford a more correct idea of what I must have suffered during my long passage. I observe here that notwithstanding the 100 days which I had just passed at sea, I still happened to be sick again on board of this packet, although the weather was not absolutely bad. This was undoubtedly very ridiculous, but no less true. The next day, I got to Ostend and landed without any observation having been made to me by any person. I again thought that this time my misfortunes were at an end and that I had recovered my liberty. But I was again mistaken. Persecutions of another kind were, on the contrary, going to begin. However, I had every reason to be satisfied with the first moments of my residence. I had not been long at the inn before an agent of the local authorities came and told me, without my being able to guess how, I had been already found out, that he had received orders to watch over me, and that he had immediately come to ask me in what manner I wished that he should fulfill his instructions. I had not been accustomed to such polite manner for a length of time, and I made this observation to him, adding that the step he had taken was quite sufficient to induce me to resign myself with entire confidence to whatever he might wish to do with me, and as his politeness had led to a prolongation of the conversation between us, which seemed greatly to excite his curiosity, he soon told me that he was going to put a question to me which was indiscreet, no doubt, and perhaps improper, but that he could not resist his desire of being informed whether it was true that I had left Napoleon because he was so much soured by misfortune that it was impossible to live with him. For the English ministerial papers had circulated 1,000 reports respecting me, one more ridiculous than the other. I replied to him with a smile, "Sir, if I had anything to say against Napoleon, if I had at least subject a complaint to adduce against him, be assured that you would not have to guard me at this moment, and that I should be far from being ill-treated anywhere." Upon which he exclaimed in his turn, striking his forehead, that such was the answer that ought to have suggested itself to his mind. His attentions towards me after this explanation became still more marked, and having learnt from me that it was my intention to go to Brussels, he imposed no other condition to the uncontrolled liberty which he left me than that of not taking my departure without informing him of it, assuring me at the same time that a determination respecting me could not be delayed 24 hours longer, as a courier had been dispatched to the governor of the province, whose return would, in all probability, set me entirely at liberty. I took advantage of the delay to which I was thus obliged to submit to write to the ministers of the police of France and of the Netherlands, respectively, concerning the situation in which I was henceforth to be placed. To the French minister I wrote the following: "Sir, I think it right on landing in the continent to inform your excellency of the circumstances in which I am placed, and I trust that you will approve the motives that induced me to do so. A year ago, I was suddenly removed from Longwood, and have been since that period carried from shore to shore like a captive. On entering the Thames, I received an order to depart instantly to the continent, having no other choice allowed to me but to proceed either to Calais or Ostend. A feeling of delicacy and prudence has prompted me to prefer Ostend. France is, of all countries, that where my appearance is most likely to be watched, and I have wished to save the department over which you preside, and myself, from the inconveniencies attending such a measure. This double consideration has induced me to adopt the cruel resolution of self-banishment. I have also been actuated by another motive, viz., the hope of possessing in this country greater facility, setting aside all political views, influenced only by private and personal feelings of affection, to procure through the legal channel allowed by the English regulations, and even under the cover of the British ministers, some alleviation and innocent consolations to the martyrs of Longwood. In France, this pious and sacred care might have been misinterpreted and might consequently have given rise to impediments. I hope that a statement so often and candid will remove all unfavorable impressions it might have been suggested to your mind by the circumstances of my case and in furtherance of that object. I now take the liberty of enclosing, under your cover, an unsealed letter from my wife, in whose favor I request the interposition of your kindness in anything relating to your functions that may facilitate the means of her coming to share my voluntary exile. To the Minister of the Netherlands, I wrote that it is usual to endeavor to escape from being rendered subject to superintendence, but that I, on the contrary, came to request to be placed under his. I repeated to him, as in the preceding letter, what had happened to me in the Thames, and that I had been thrown on the continent without any motive having been adduced or any cause assigned for this measure. I informed him that I had just written to the Minister of the Police of France to lay before him the motives that induced me to expose myself to voluntary exile. I represented to him that I was very ill and that the state of my son's health was most alarming, that I had just made a passage of 100 days' duration in a very small vessel, that I was entirely ignorant as to whether my wife and family were still in existence, that I was totally in the dark respecting the state of my domestic concerns. And taking all these circumstances into consideration, I entreated him to allow me to reside for a few days at Brussels, to breathe and look around me, to send for my wife, and have the benefit of the attendance of physicians, adding that perhaps in the meantime the British ministers, whose harsh and precipitate conduct towards me must necessarily have been founded on some error, would consent to allow me to be present agreeably to my request at the examination of the papers which they had taken from me. In conclusion, I assured him that I entertained no political views or feelings, that my sentiments were solely sentiments of individual affection and personal attachment, that such sentiments were natural and honorable, and that my open avowal of them must afford a perfect security that they were not calculated to give any cause of uneasiness. I owe it to justice and to gratitude to state that my letter to the Minister of the Police of France had at least the effect of obtaining from him, when occasions offered, all that might be expected from a gentleman. Such was not the case with respect to the Minister of the Netherlands. The only answer I received from him was the arrival of guards to secure my person. Orders were sent in every direction to find me out again, for they thought I was lost. As I had been told by the person entrusted with the superintendence over me, the permission from the governor to continue my journey had soon arrived, and I had immediately taken advantage of it, choosing, on account of the weak state of my health, the easy but obscure and slow conveyance of the barges and canals. This had not been thought of, and they were seeking for me at a great distance from Ostend, whilst I was still almost at its gates. My unsuspecting confidence and security had baffled all their calculations. They had not yet got the exact description of my person, and were consequently much embarrassed to know me. However, I myself soon put an end to their perplexity by coming and delivering myself up, as the saying is, into the wolf's jaws. My first step after my arrival at Brussels, which I reached late in the evening after a journey of 3 days, was to send to inform the police of my being in that city and ask what had been the determination of the minister relative to my case, in consequence of the letter which I had addressed to him from Ostend. The generous answer to my innocent confidence was to send instantly to surround the inn where I was, and they waited with impatience the first dawn of day to signify to me that I must leave the kingdom of the Netherlands without the least delay. I was very much indisposed and had some degree of fever about me. Nevertheless, I vainly appealed to their compassion and asked to be allowed to stay 1 day longer. Very serious obstacles must certainly have existed to my being permitted to sojourn in Brussels, or a predisposition to treat me with cruelty, for I was not allowed even 1 hour. They placed me in a carriage between a police officer and a gendarme, and turned me on the high road. These people, who saw my condition, took compassion upon me, and after a few hours' journey consented to stop in order that I might procure a little rest and some requisite medical attendance, but under the express condition that I should resume my journey at an early hour on the following morning, in charge of the guards appointed to succeed them, a system that was strictly acted upon and repeated in every town, notwithstanding the repeated observations and the testimony of all medical men. This cruel treatment compelled me to complain to the French ambassador at the court of the Netherlands, who I thought would warmly resist such a proceeding, for it was an insult to his public character to treat in this manner without any just motive and in direct violation of the laws a Frenchman who was placed under his protection. I therefore informed him of the vexatious and inhuman conduct which was then exercised towards me. I told him that upon landing at Ostend, I had written to the French Minister of Police to state to him my motives for remaining out of France, that I had also written at the same time to the Minister of the Police of the Netherlands, requesting he would allow me to sojourn a short time in Brussels, and that having reached that city at a late hour, without having been guarded or placed under any superintendence, I had hastened to inform His Excellency of my arrival, but that I had been suddenly awakened before daylight on the following morning and surrounded by 4 police officers and 2 gendarmes, who signified to me that I must instantly depart, notwithstanding the very precarious state of my health, that I had in vain demanded a physician to verify my case, that I had been told that I should be allowed one for form's sake, but that I must depart whatever might be his opinion. That, in fact, I had been removed from Louvain like a malefactor, and in the last stage of sickness under the escort of a gendarme and of a police officer, that having arrived in this town during the night, suffering from increased illness, covered with blisters, and in a state of fever, I had asked to be allowed to stop the following day, that the burgomaster had been inhuman enough to refuse my request in spite of 2 or 3 very strong medical certificates, and having demanded that the physician at least might accompany me in the carriage instead of the gendarme who could follow on horseback, this favor had also been refused to me. That all could be allowed, they said, was that the physician should accompany me in another carriage. This was no doubt a piece of irony. I added that I was quite certain that such treatment could not proceed from him, who alone, however, on this occasion would have a right to exercise any influence over my fate, that I was too well acquainted with the sentiments of the nation to which we belong to suppose for a moment that his instructions could decree the prescription of a person towards whom there neither was nor could be any law or motive for such a proceeding, that the ill usage I experienced could therefore only proceed from the authorities of this country, where, however, in common justice, I ought not to be considered in any other light than as a traveler, that as such I would demand of them what was my crime and what were their rights over my person. And I ended by placing my interests under his care, and his situation made him their natural protector. And with the view of calling his attention more particularly upon me, I gave him news of Madame Bertrand, his wife's sister, which I had received just as I was leaving Dover, and I offered myself in case of Madame de la Tour du Pin wished to say anything to her sister, to whom it would afford the greatest pleasure to take charge of it, as I proposed to write to Madame Bertrand regularly once a month by the channel which the English regulations allowed, viz. Under the very cover of ministers. His Excellency made no reply to this letter. His endeavors no doubt proved unavailing. The impulse of very orders perhaps emanated at this time from the other side of the water. I continued in this manner without intermission, transferred from town to town, from one police officer to another, from gendarme to gendarme, across the whole kingdom of the Netherlands. And when I occasionally asked, in the height of my sufferings, what could be the motive for so harsh a treatment, I was simply told in reply that such were the orders that had been given, and in fact this was all that appeared to be known on the subject. I arrived at Aix-la-Chapelle on the Prussian territory. I was there exchanged by the agents of the Netherlands for a receipt, as might have been done with a bale of goods, and the Prussians in their turn hurried me along with equal rapidity from place to place, from officer to officer, and from gendarme to gendarme. And when I inquired of them also the motive of all this, they candidly answered, that they didn't know it, but that I had been thrown into their country and that they were going to throw me out of it. If I asked to stop, they politely replied that they would not keep me upon their territory and sent friends, for it will hereafter be seen that I found friends everywhere. Whispered in my ear that I ought to thank God for it, and above all things, to take immediate advantage of this piece of good fortune, as some exiled Frenchmen had lately been forced upon the shores of the Baltic and shut up in fortresses. I then declared that I desired to go to Frankfurt, an expression which appeared to give pleasure to my hosts, the Prussians, as they said it would no longer concern them. After what I had just learned, I was equally rejoiced at this upon my own account, after having described, but very feebly, all the savage brutality that had just been exercised upon me, all the vexations and sufferings that I had endured. It would be unjust and ungrateful in me, and I should be depriving myself of the most gratifying sensation were I to omit mentioning the kind of compensation which I found at every step of the journey. My story had made a great noise. It had spread in every direction. It preceded me. The public papers had laid hold of it. It was known whom I had served, to whom I had wished to devote my care, for whom I suffered, and all endeavored to mark their sense of my conduct. All classes were eager to evince every mark of attention and sympathy towards me, and open demonstrations or secret offers awaited me everywhere. It was then that those words of Napoleon occurred to my mind, which I have, by the way, had many subsequent occasions to recall to my recollection. My dear friends, when you shall have returned to Europe, you will find that from this spot I still bestow crowns. And can there be a nobler, a more precious one than the esteem, the affection, the sympathy of those even who know you not and have never seen you? What hand, however powerful, can bestow anything of equal value? These feelings manifested themselves at inns, upon the high roads, everywhere. Postboys, gendarmes, all that I met with on my journey addressed me with a kind of pride and exultation. One said, I belonged to the Imperial Guard. Another, I was a French gendarme. A third, I have been a soldier under Napoleon. These recollections and the feelings of goodwill to which they gave rise appeared in all classes and all conditions. Twice in Belgium, I was offered to be carried off. Everything having been, I was informed, carefully prepared beforehand. The same offer had already been made to me at the Cape by an American captain, and a similar proposal was made to me at a later period on the part of some Englishman to whom I was quite unknown, and who had resolved to come from London in order to carry me off from Frankfurt, where they thought me in a much worse situation than I really was. But I invariably replied, what purpose would that answer? Why should I injure so noble a cause? The very agents of authority felt an anxiety concerning my fate and a kind of interest for me. One of them, although appointed to watch me, offered to take charge of any paper I would venture to entrust to his care. I availed myself of his offer, as I did not see any inconvenience in so doing, even if he had some bad intention, as he might possibly have. And I addressed to a person of high rank in England a letter of half a dozen lines describing with warmth the ill usage which the British ministers had made me suffer for the last 12 months, and requesting that he would publish my statement if he sought no objection to it. I enclosed with the same view that part of the emperor's letter, which I had been allowed to copy, adding that I should have continued to keep it to myself, had not the ridiculous and insulting reports which were inserted in the newspapers rendered it imperative upon me to make it public. I, however, left to his discretion to decide what should be done. How great was my surprise to see the whole published in the Belgic papers 2 days afterwards. I was extremely mortified at it. It was not at all consistent with my disposition to wish to make so much noise. I was, however, especially hurt that the person in England to whom I addressed my letter and to whom I was unknown should receive it only through the public press. This mode of proceeding was also totally inconsistent with my manners. I was at a loss to conceive how the thing could have happened. I have since learned that my confidant, in the warmth of his zeal, had consulted with 2 or 3 persons of the same way of thinking, and that the papers having been read in their little council, they had decided that instead of losing time and sending them to England, where perhaps no use would be made of them, it would be better to publish them instantly on the spot, where indeed They created a very lively sensation. Notwithstanding the trouble that I then suffered from them, they proved in the event of the most single advantage to me. In short, there would be no end to it were I to mention the affecting marks of attention that were shown to me, the offers of all kinds, in money, clothes, etc. Even people of the very lowest class were eager to tend to their mite, one of them, forcing his way into my apartment, from which he was pulled back by the gendarmes, cried out to me that he had only 2 coats, that he saw by my size that the second would not fit me, that he was therefore going to sell it and would throw me the amount through the window. What sufferings, what torments would not be effaced by the sensations which such acts must produce. I was, however, so ill on arriving at Cologne that it was found necessary to allow me to stop 24 hours in that town. This increase of suffering turned out a fortunate circumstance for me. I was in a gentle sleep when on a sudden the valet de place rushed into my apartment with demonstrations of that joy which the bearer of good news is sure to occasion, and even to experience, and announced to me Madame de las Casas. I had not yet been able to ascertain whether she was alive, and therefore thought that I had misunderstood the man or was dreaming. But in a moment after, the door was thrown open. It was she herself. The poor dear woman, notwithstanding the inclemency of the season, had been running after me a considerable time through rain and snow without being able to overtake me. As soon as she had learnt through the medium of the newspapers my arrival in Europe and my removal to Ostend, she had started immediately for the latter place. And it was only at the entrance of that town that she had heard I had already left it. She had since been following me, tracing my steps by the persecutions and vexations to which I was exposed, and which everyone related to her as she proceeded, even the common passengers on the road, or which she read every morning in the newspapers, and herself receiving also everywhere and from everyone those expressions of interest and benevolence, those marks of attention and zeal, of which it will be seen that I had been the object. Thus, for many days, she was exposed to the most tantalizing vexation of being always within a few hours' distance from me, without being able to overtake me. But for this accidental delay at Cologne, she would not have succeeded even now. Residence in Germany, space of 15 months. The band of captives arrived at last at Frankfurt after having during 15 days undergone persecutions almost unexampled in civilized countries, and in a state of tranquility. A Prussian officer, whose duty he politely said was not so much to guard me as to see that I was well treated, had conducted me thither. He did not allow me to communicate freely with any person, and was not to leave me until some authentic and final decision had been adopted with respect to me. On arriving at Frankfurt, I immediately sent to our ambassador, as I had done in the Netherlands, the following letter. Sir, I have the honor, on arriving in this town, to claim the protection of your public character against the rigorous measures which have been adopted against me for some time past. I have been arrested and am carried about from town to town under escort against my will like a captive. Those who act thus candidly confess that they only push me on in that manner because I have been so brought to them, and they have not any special motive or positive order on the subject. On my passage through the Netherlands, I have addressed a representation on the subject to our ambassador at the court of The Hague, but I have been hurried on so precipitately that it has not been possible for me to receive any answer. I take the liberty of sending you a copy of the letter which I addressed to him in order to put your excellency in possession of the first details of my adventure. It is now, sir, the 130th day of my traveling. I am harassed, tired, sick, and infirm. I have been tossed by the fury of the waves, and must perish at last if I cannot find a port. In the name of humanity and justice, I implore to be allowed to take breath for a moment. I have found an erroneous impression existing everywhere in my way, and those who thus disposed of my persons have all expressed the greatest surprise when the discussion of the point has proved that there did not exist in France any law or act, either public or private, directed against me, and that nothing had ever occurred that could give rise to such a proceeding. I request, sir, that you will be kind enough to prevent by your testimony the possibility of an error that might influence the decision to be taken with respect to me, and that you will grant me the protection which I am naturally entitled to expect from you in your public character. P.S. I think it right to inform your excellency that in the perplexity of my situation, I wrote a few days since to His Majesty the Emperor of Austria to request an asylum in his dominions should my liberty be placed under any restraint. But a distant country, the language and manners of which are quite new to me, cannot suit me except in case of necessity. I should wish to be as near to France as possible in order to be able to see my family and attend to my domestic concerns, which have been neglected for the last 3 years. And Brussels, which in addition to these advantages possesses that of the language which would enable me to superintend the education of my children, is the place in which I should be happy to reside. I have requested Monsieur La Tour du Pin at The Hague to obtain the necessary permission to enable me to do so, and I earnestly entreat you to assist him in as far as it lies in your power. The same thing that had happened in the Netherlands happened also in Frankfurt. I received no answer to my letter, but His Excellency did not remain idle with respect to me. I have been assured that he had immediately required from the Senate of this free and sovereign city my removal within the space of 24 hours. Fortunately, the Prussian officer who was obliged to follow me and who did not relish such a continuation of our journey induced the minister from his court to interfere in order that I might be allowed to stay at Frankfurt. Discussions were therefore held on my case, and I had at first resolved to wait patiently to see to whom the charge of my person would remain, but in compliance with some good advice that was given to me, I applied to the minister of Austria, the Baron de Westenberg, to inform him that I had applied to his sovereign to implore an asylum in his dominions, and that I should consider myself fortunate in being allowed to await his decision here. These few words, addressed to a man of honorable and generous feelings, were quite sufficient to put an immediate end to the fresh vexations to which I was exposed. He instantly interfered, declared that I was temporarily under the protection of his sovereign, and demanded that things should remain in status quo until he heard from his court. From that instant, everything became calm, and the tide of British persecutions, which, rolling from afar, had so long harassed my existence, was at last stopped. The Senate allowed me to reside in Frankfurt, and the Prussian officer took his departure. Politeness now succeeded to churlishness. Prince Hardenberg, to whom I had written to complain of my arrest in the Rhenish provinces, replied that he had been very angry about it himself. An answer came from Vienna, most graciously granting the asylum which I had demanded. I was now free, and I acquired also the hope of seeing my liberty respected for the future. For the Duke of Richelieu, Minister of Foreign Affairs, to whom our ambassador at Frankfurt applied respecting me, answered, I was told that I should be left unmolested. The Duke of Richelieu, feeling his independence, had no doubt only followed the impulse of his natural generosity, whereas it must be presumed that these sentiments were restrained in the rest of our ambassador at Frankfurt by the necessity of giving pledges of his fidelity, having been formerly Napoleon's minister at the court of King Jerome. This line of conduct was very proper on his part, no doubt, but I had a right to think it unfortunate that it had on this occasion been pursued at my expense. My first care, as soon as I was at liberty to dispose of my actions, was entirely directed to the grand motive which had caused my departure from St. Helena and brought me back to Europe. Though repulsed from London, where I had founded my greatest hopes, I nevertheless embraced with ardor the means that were still left to me. I first wrote to Maria Louisa, as in duty bound, and addressed my letter to her unsealed and under the cover of Prince Metternich, principal minister of Austria. I afterwards wrote to the 3 allied sovereigns. I transcribe here those letters. Letter to Maria Louisa, written at the Cape of Good Hope and forwarded to Europe. Madame, I have no sooner left St. Helena than I think it my duty to hasten to lay at the feet of your Majesty some intelligence from your august consort. I have been suddenly torn from his presence without any previous notice, and as it were struck with sudden death at his side, without the possibility of his having foreseen such an event. I am not therefore fortunate enough to be entrusted with any special message for your Majesty, and it is from his everyday habits and conversation that I must collect with details I shall presume to transmit to your Majesty. Indifferent to public events, the Emperor Napoleon most frequently indulged in the contemplation of his family recollections and affections. He was grieved at not having ever received, although he had occasionally demanded it of those who guard him, any news from those who are most dear to him. Your Majesty will find the lively expression of that regret traced by the hand of your illustrious consort in the letter which he did me the honor to write me after I had been separated from him, a copy of which I shall take the liberty of laying before your Majesty. The health of the Emperor at my departure was very much impaired, and his situation was most painful in every respect, being exposed to numerous wants and deprived of every enjoyment. Fortunately, his mind triumphed unhurt and remained calm and serene. I have seen him obliged every month to sell part of his plate to supply his daily wants, and he has been reduced to accept a small sum which a faithful servant was fortunate enough to have at his disposal in England when he left him. Madame, guided by the sentiments which fill my heart, I take the liberty as a devoted servant to lay at the feet of your Majesty in the hope of being agreeable to you a sacrifice which is dear to me, being some hair of your august consort, which has been a long time in my possession. I presume also to send at the same time to your Majesty a plan of Longwood drawn by my son for his mother. Your Majesty will no doubt feel interested in examining in its details this remote desert. On arriving in Europe, my first step would be to go and throw myself at the feet of your Majesty, if a sacred duty did not oblige me to remain in England in order to devote every instant of my life to endeavor to impart, through the means allowed by the British regulations, some consolation to the inhabitants of that horrible rock, which must ever retain the object of my most tender cares. The British ministers will not refuse to allow me to undertake this pious occupation. I shall solicit it with ardor and fulfill it with loyalty. Countless causes. P.S. On my arrival in Europe, Madame, I have been ejected by England, arrested on the continent, detained by sickness at Frankfurt, and have just obtained an asylum in the dominions of your august father. I take advantage of the first moment of my liberty to address to your Majesty the above letter that was written for you at the extremity of Africa, at a distance of 3,000 leagues. I entreat your Majesty to deign to receive it favorably, and that will be some consolation for my sufferings. Letter to Prince Metternich, containing the preceding. Prince, I hasten to offer your Highness my sincere thanks for the favor of an asylum obtained in the dominions of His Majesty the Emperor. I take the liberty at the same time to enclose under cover to you a letter for Her Majesty Maria Louisa. And here, Prince, I entreat you to allow me to lay aside the public character with which your Highness is invested, to address you in your private character only. I wish to ask for advice rather than to accomplish an act. Having been so long absent from Europe, I might unknowingly and unwillingly transgress the rules of expediency. I give myself up to the effusion of my heart. Prince, the result of these different feelings has been to induce me to confide this letter, which I enclose herein unsealed, to your discretion and personal judgment. It is again the result of these same feelings which impels me to represent to you the Emperor Napoleon, a prey on his rock to the persecution of some personal enemies, and abandoned by all the rest of the world. Henceforth I shall live only in the hope of affording him some sources of consolation from a daily intercourse of 18 months, and I may say from some moments of unreserved confidence. I know those who would be most dear to him and who can know Napoleon better than I do. He already feels and converses on the subjects of the past events of his own history as if they happened 300 years ago. He has only remained unchanged with respect to family feelings, whatever political events may have occurred. He entertains no doubt on the score of domestic sentiments. How, through what channels, by what means could I, without transgressing the rules of expediency or any regulations and intentions, obtain direct intelligence concerning his wife and his son? Prince, I again repeat that this communication is from man to man. It is one heart questioning another. During my residence at St. Helena, we have not had intercourse, nor been able to have any with the commissioner from Austria. Your Highness must have read in a public document written in answer to the governor that if the Austrian and Russian commissioners had been sent to see that Napoleon was treated in a proper manner and with the respect due him, this measure was in harmony with the character of their sovereigns. But that the governor, having declared that they had no right nor authority to interfere on the subject, had by that declaration rendered them inadmissible. At the same time, Napoleon publicly said that he would willingly receive them as private individuals, yet we have not seen them. Be it that such was the tenor of their instructions, or, as I have more reason to suppose, that the governor wished to subject them as private individuals to restrictions which would have degraded their character, your Highness will see by the copy of the letter transcribed for Her Majesty Maria Louisa the severity used towards an Austrian botanist and how much the Emperor Napoleon was hurt by that circumstance. I again repeat to your Highness the expressions of the nature of my sentiments and the assurances of the high respect with which I am Countess de las Casas. P.S. In case my letter for Her Majesty Maria Louisa should not be delivered to her, I request your Highness will do me the particular favor to cause the hair which is enclosed in it to be returned to me.